Moving the needle. Welcome to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast.
Curating communications, media, and tech policy news so you don't have to. News, interviews, everything you need without the axe to grind. It's the Washing Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
The DOJ drops espionage charges against a Temple professor. The U.S. and EU agree to share data, and the FCC establishes a hot clock for Charter and Time Warner Cable. The House passed legislation last Tuesday entitled the E-Warranty Act, which would allow electronic device makers to issue warranty information electronically. Currently, device makers are required to issue warranty information via print. Of the 309 representatives who voted, just 2 opposed: Michigan Republican Representative Dr. Dan Benishek and North Carolina Republican Walter Jones, Jr. The next step is President Obama's desk for signature. The Justice Department has dropped its economic espionage charges against Temple University professor and Physics Department Chair Chi-Chao Ching. Chi was originally charged with wire fraud and attempting to share competitive information about a semiconductor company with China. The U.S. and EU have agreed to a data-sharing agreement despite a strained relationship following the Ed Snowden leaks. Under the agreement, EU citizens would have the right to sue in the U.S. if their personal data is misused. But Congress would have to pass a law first, and the Judicial Redress Act, co-sponsored by Connecticut Republican Chris Murphy and Senate Finance Committee Chairman Republican Orrin Hatch, seeks to do just that. The FCC has established its shot clock for its review of the Charter-Time Warner Cable merger. Comments are due October 13th. Reply comments are due on November 2nd. The FCC is coming down on Lyft, the car-sharing service, for its robocalls. Users are currently unable to use Lyft's services without giving automatic consent to receive robocalls. The FCC warned Lyft that the policy violates the Telephone Consumer Protection Act because there is no genuine opt-out. The FAA is supposed to pass regulations by September 30th, which would pave the way for commercial drone use, but it looks like the agency is going to miss the deadline. And at a House Judiciary Committee subcommittee hearing last Thursday, California Republican Representative Darrell Issa said the FAA's delay is a punt. New York Democratic Representative Jerry Nadler said addressing the safety of drones will take time, as will the appropriate distinction between the FCC's authority to regulate drone transmissions and the FAA's authority to regulate airspace. Jesse Jackson Sr. is expanding his efforts to improve diversity and inclusion in the tech sector by focusing now on so-called unicorn startups, those worth $1 billion or more. Few of these companies have released their diversity statistics. Tech and auto companies have come together with a proposal to share the 5.9 gigahertz band. The FCC would bear the burden of addressing any signal interference. At an American Enterprise Institute event, FCC Republican Commissioner Ajit Pai said the FCC's net neutrality order has reduced investment in telecom. Hello, insiders, and welcome to the relaunch of the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. My name is Joe Miller, and I created this podcast because when I was working at a Washington, D.C. think tank on media and tech policy issues, I just remember having reams upon reams of information to go through every single day to stay on top of what was happening. I had to keep track of research. I had to stay on top of legislative and political changes, regulatory filings, new notices and rulemakings from the FCC, not to mention developments at the White House, Department of Commerce, the FTC. The list goes on and on. I had to stay on top of business news, the latest and greatest social media strategies to push out content. I'd be in my car and on the metro and on the bus on my daily commute into DC and say to myself, I really wish I could listen to everything I need to stay on top of so that I am not just wasting all of this time sitting here in traffic or single tracking on the metro. If you take the DC Metro frequently, or really any metropolitan subway system, you're all too familiar with single tracking. In any case, I'd think to myself, if I could just listen to everything I need, at least I'd be caught up and not get into work exhausted from my commute without having even done anything yet. So I created the podcast last year, actually in 2014. I produced 67 daily episodes and had a pretty good response rate. So I decided to take a step back, reconfigure, add a little cinnamon and spice to the recipe, and put together something even better for you all. And that's what I've tried to create in this podcast, the Washington Tech Policy Podcast. And that brings me to my next point, which is that this podcast is not about me. It's not even necessarily about the issues. It's about you and what you need to make your job easier and help the workday go by just a little bit faster so you can do more of the things you enjoy. Your time is so precious, insiders, and the blog, the Data Points newsletter, and all the things we have in store for you are designed to help you stay on top of what's happening in media and tech policymaking. In this podcast, I'm going to do my best to cover the hottest topics of the day, whether you're in the Beltway or not. We'll focus on cybersecurity, intellectual property, drones, broadband, STEM, education, even off the beaten path topics like psychology and creativity, things that affect innovation directly and indirectly, are all fair game for this podcast. Diversity and inclusion will be a central topic on this podcast as well. We have all seen the numbers recently of tech companies releasing disappointing statistics in hiring of people from diverse backgrounds, whether it's where they went to school, whether they're men or women, Black or Hispanic. This podcast will work to help facilitate a lot of that dialogue as well. As far as the format of the show is concerned, today we're starting with episode 000, which is the episode you're listening to right now. It's the About Me episode, sort of like the first day of class. But today you will also see episode 001, which features Kim Scott from Arizona State, 002, which features an interview with Adriana Waterston from Horowitz Associates in New York, and Rob Atkinson, president and CEO of ITIF here in Washington, for episode 3. Then every Tuesday from now on, I'll release another episode. You should know that the news headlines will be the same for all 3 episodes this week. So if you have already heard the news, feel free to fast forward to the interview portion. I repeated the news on each episode this week so you can get to the headlines whether you start with episode 3 or episode 1. So this will be a weekly podcast, and the format will be a wrap-up of all the week's news, followed by an interview with a policymaker, entrepreneur, academic, anyone cool and interesting that has some connection to media and tech. There are the wonky policy issues we're all accustomed to, but there are other issues that influence tech policy, the goals of tech policy that don't always make it to the Beltway. So when we talk about innovation, that means we're talking about creativity. So we might have an artist on the show. Psychology is another topic that comes into play. In conversations about diversity in tech employment, psychology is important for understanding how we tend to think about talent. What is the psychology behind achievement, and how can we use it to inform the dialogue around policymaking? This podcast is near and dear to my heart. It took a long time to figure out how to take my experience and make it useful to you. So I hope that's what this podcast does. And of course, I'm always learning, falling down and getting up again. That's what it's all about, insiders. Whether it's about entrepreneurship or pushing that piece of legislation or regulation your livelihood depends on, it's all a process of trial and error. I started out my career many years ago while I was a high school student. If you've ever seen the movie Fame, that's where I went to high school. But as soon as I got my working papers, I went to work in radio. So I took a job at New York's Hot 97, which was a dance radio station back in the late 80s and early 90s. I was the guy who answered the request line, who ran the board, who went out to the beaches at promotional events. To this day, you can hear that influence of those very early days of my career in the podcast intro, for example. Those production values with the great Rachel West as the main announcer are a tribute to some of my earliest days in broadcasting. I followed my passions, interned at KTU, also in New York, and my first job out of college, my first full-time job, was at the New York Times WQXR in ad sales. That was a great place to work, but I decided to go to law school at night. Yes, I don't know what I was thinking, insiders. I commuted every day from Briarwood, Queens into Midtown to work at a publishing company, and then down to Tribeca every Monday through Thursday, and then back again on the A, then to the F, all the way back to Queens, not getting home until around 11 at night. I'm not sure what I was thinking, but I got it done. I graduated months after September 11th when the job market in New York was terrible. So I moved to D.C. for greener pastures, and then went to work for the Minority Media and Telecom Council, and then the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And these are the places I cut my teeth initially, getting to know a lot of you who are listening to this podcast. And here I am. I really hope that this podcast is for you what I intend it to be, a resource to make your life easier and more organized and add some structure to the uncertainty, stress, and constant pressure to deliver results. If you ever want to reach out to me with feedback, please do. You can reach me directly at jmiller@washingtech.com. That's jmiller@washingtech.com. I read all of my emails. Tell me what you think. Should the podcast be weekly? Are there topics I should emphasize? Are there particular guests you'd like to hear from? Did you hear something on the podcast you didn't like? Please let me know so I can design this podcast, not the way I think you want it, but the way you actually want it. With that, insiders, I am pleased to finally launch this thing after months of preparation. I'll stop here and let you explore.
Thanks for listening to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. You've been briefed.